Hello, everybody. This is Roberto Salinas-León from Mexico City. I would especially like to thank Barbara Colm and the entire team at the Free Market Roadshow for making possible this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the nature of the nanny state in Latin America, and especially during these times of COVID-19 disruption, pandemic lockdowns, and quasi-black swan events that have emerged all over our region. So I direct the Center for Latin America at Atlas Network, and since the outbreak of the pandemic, we have been deeply engaged among over 100 think tanks that belong to our free market network in the region, in the Latin American region, precisely on the different policy challenges, the answers, and the doubts that have emerged amidst such atypical times since the pandemic broke out. We're actually coming out with a book trying to come out with different proposals and different ideas of how to address the post-pandemic recovery and what the world will look like. And I think this is very important, not just in terms of what the concept of the nanny state represents in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, in our entire region, but also to think long and hard about how the ideas of liberty, just as after the Second World War, it is only the ideas of liberty that will be able to give us the wherewithal in order to construct a proper sustained recovery after the pandemic and the tremendous economic damage that it has occasioned. But part of what we need to think about as well is the political challenge, the specific political challenge amid the rise of autocracy and authoritarianism that we've seen all over the world. In particular, in Latin America, what Tom Palmer characterizes as a rising tide of illiberal populism has dominated discourse, has dominated political reality. It is no longer an issue of left versus right. I would say not even of capitalism versus socialism. It is not the good guys against the bad guys. It is not us versus them. It is rather this wide-ranging phenomenon of how illiberal populists, presuming to have a monopoly on the truth and a privileged access to reality, impose their models, whether these are identified as right-wing or left-wing or the center or up or down. It really doesn't matter anymore. It's rather this climate of intolerance in which, during a time of pandemic, precisely has bred the emergence of these different voices, this different specimen of politician that emerges and imposes his or her preconceived version of the world upon us. And of course, accompany that is the nanny state, almost an empowered nanny state. Because of course, what does the politician offer? It can be Donald Trump in the United States, or it can be Joe Biden. It can be Andrés Manuel López Obrador here in Mexico, or it can be Ricardo Anaya also in Mexico. It could be Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or it could be Sebastián Piñera in Chile, or it can be Alberto Fernández, the would-be Kirchnerian Peronist in Argentina. In Colombia, a country that has suffered enormously during the pandemic and the lockdowns, we've seen Iván Duque, a very centrist politician with many very good free market ideas, be challenged by the rising political movement headed by Petro, a would-be populist that sometimes makes some of our earlier populists look like Cinderella. These are very, very trying times in our countries. But everybody, every single one of these politicians is always promising a version of the free lunch, whether it be free vaccines or free medical health care or free nutrition or free access to a dignified lifestyle. Whatever it is, in all of its in all of its developments, the idea of a handout, the idea of a free lunch, has bred the 21st century version of what Octavio Paz, the great Mexican Nobel Prize winner, literate and poet and public intellectual, characterized as the philanthropic ogre, el ogro filantrópico. El ogro filantrópico, the idea of the state as a giant ogre that all of a sudden begins to say, now I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to give you that, and I'm going to give you free lunches, and I'm going to give to specific sectors. All of these sectors that become beneficiaries of handouts, of government handouts, all also become political clients. These clientelismos, these clientels that all of a sudden develop throughout our region are what sustain these illiberal populists, many of whom are highly anti-democratic and enemies of liberal democracy in its core. Why? Because, of course, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the incentives are there to use the philanthropic ogre, to use the nanny state in order to perpetuate their power. Such atypical times as these provide a different excuse. Since we're living atypical times, since we're living post-pandemic emergencies, since we're living the economic consequences of COVID, therefore, I should stay longer in power. Therefore, I should invoke emergency powers in order to be able to sustain my power at an even longer time. And this threatens the institutional wherewithal of our liberal democracies throughout Latin America. COVID-19 disruption from the very outset occasioned therefore a deep economic and political impact. On the economic impact, I personally very much sympathize with the idea proposed by none other than Carmen Reinhart, the co-author of that great book, This Time is Different, arguing, now that she is head of the chief economist of the World Bank, now it's even more powerful to hear her out. And she said, well, contrary to 800 years of financial folly and financial crises, this time it really is different. And what does she mean by this? She meant that because of the pandemic and because of the lockdowns imposed to try to address the pandemic, this occasioned a freeze not just of aggregate demand, but also of aggregate supply. It's as if human beings all of a sudden emerged after the pandemic was declared into a zombie world of an economy of zombies, where there was no commerce whatsoever, where there was no demand and no supply, and where growth suffered an enormous collapse not seen since the Great Depression. Tremendous amount of financial volatility ensued, depreciation of currencies, a great deal of uncertainty, fear and trembling as the main guides of economic activity. What emerged after was probably more akin to a K-shaped recovery, as some have called it, where some sectors, such as, for instance, these technologies that enable us to continue to communicate, and other highly technological innovations, all of a sudden exploded in growth, whereas others, traditional retail, restaurants, tourism, suffered a great setback and tremendous economic downturn. As we emerge from the COVID-19 economic consequences, we have to think hard about the opportunities that are available to policymakers and to policy analysts to think hard about how we can combine a free market approach that is able also to soften the impact of this virtual economic depression, and especially now that in several countries, certainly this occurs in Latin America, Venezuela and Argentina in particular, the fears of rising inflation, a new wave of currency depreciations. So I think, to make a very long story short, that Carmen Reinhart is correct in thinking that our balance sheets and our macroeconomic scenarios are going to present some tremendous challenges as we look forward. When you have countries running fiscal deficits of 18%, of 20%, of over 20%, when you have debt to GDP ratios that surpass 100%, perhaps this can be done. It shouldn't, but perhaps even so, it can be done in developed countries. But in emerging economies, or in economies that have suffered already from lack of growth and from fiscal irresponsibility in the past, to be able to engage in grandiose fiscal experiments of using monetary expansion and fiscal expansion to regenerate growth and emerge out of the pandemic are very, very dangerous experiments. They're akin to using morphine in order to be able to finance our growth. The political consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic has been, as I have mentioned before, the rise of autocrats and the rise of a strengthened authoritarianism. If I presume to have the answers to all of our problems in such atypical times, then why not should I remain in power? So we see Bukele in El Salvador, we see Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, we see Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Fernandez in Argentina, and a whole host of other political figures emerging as would-be autocrats that try to strengthen their political resolve in order to impose preconceived solutions and in order to impose easy solutions that simply redistribute the pie. There is no surprise, as Manuel Heinz would say in his new book, In Defense of Liberal Democracy, there is no surprise that dialogue has collapsed in the middle of this disruption, that there are no exchange of narratives, there's no real civilized conversation on what solutions we can propose as we look forward to. The nanny state, so conceived, departs from a clear zero-sum mentality. Let's take from this group in order to give to that group. Unfortunately, this redistribution, this purported redistribution of wealth, takes place at a time when wealth has shrunk, when there's been not a concentration, but actually a scenario where wealth has diminished, and where what we have to do is go back to an opportunity where we can regenerate wealth, where wealth can once again expand amid a climate of sustained growth, where we can capture the magic of compound interest, where we can capture the magic of 7% growth, over 7%, over 7%. I don't think this is inconceivable even in our times, but I think that it's very important to think about simple rules for a complex world, very important to think about the type of principles that we need to embrace and the ideas of liberty that we need to embrace as we look forward. In the Center for Latin America, we have stressed a great deal about the need to be able to think on a proactive agenda, not necessarily to criticize these authoritarianisms, these autocracies, these fatal conceits of thinking that just by simply rearranging the current pie of wealth, our job is done. Our job as far as development is concerned is done. This becomes very easy for politicians to perpetuate their power, the abuse of the philanthropic ogre and of the nanny state. Rather, we also need to complement our work with a proactive agenda, thinking about liberty for innovation. What are the policies that are going to be able to enhance inclusive prosperity? How to tie liberty to human dignity? In many occasions in Latin America, especially in the informal economy, it's the lack of legal certainty. It's the lack of access to property titles, to the institutional certainty that what is mine is actually mine. It is precisely that threatens human dignity altogether. And it is very important, we think, to be able to link policies to an inclusive framework that is able to empower citizens with opportunities for growth, but also opportunities to enhance their own human dignity in their families and in their communities. This proactive agenda is 21st century. This proactive agenda, positive agenda of growth, of inclusive prosperity, stresses flexibility, stresses adaptability, stresses innovation, and it stresses particularly social mobility. It is the opportunity of upward mobility rather than redistribution of wealth, what will enable us to combat the myths, the great myths of the nanny state, and to be able also to combat the rising tide of liberal populism among all these autocrats. For this reason, we think at the Center for Latin America, at Atlas Network, that it is essential to take a good look at what is occurring in Latin America as an example, in some cases, of what to do, but especially of what not to do in these very atypical and trying times of COVID-19 disruption. At the end of the day, we have to remember the simple truths of the ideas of liberty. And one of these truths is essential. When trade is free and voluntary, locally and internationally, one side benefits only if the other side benefits. This is what Manuel Ayau used to teach us. And this is the great principle that I think will enable us to combat the zero-sum mentality that pervades the nanny state, that pervades the philanthropic ogre, and the myths that simply by redistributing what we have today, we'll be able to get ahead. No, it is a matter of making the pie far greater and far more inclusive for all of us engaged. This is true of Latin America, and it is also true of the world. And it is certainly true of the tremendous work that this Free Market Roadshow tries to bring to all of us engaged. Barbara, once again, many thanks for this kind invitation. I hope to be able to join you once again in the future. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.